Well, it's an honor to be here with Brett Story and Steve Mang, who have directed a brilliant documentary called Union. Brett, I know a bit more because we were Chicken and Egg Award fellows in the same cohort. And Steve, I've admired your work through the years. And I would love for Brazilian audiences to see your film and Latin American audiences and European audiences, as this is such a global story of how these tech market companies are eroding our social fabric, but at the same time, how to resist to it. And it's a story that shows also the complexities of forming a union that doesn't go into the more, I would say, like Hollywood narrative of a one-man show, but shows the complexities of a collectivity. And I would love to ask you a question that I know you're tired of, but like, how did the idea come to document this historical moment, and how did you both pair up? And then we'll get to more interesting questions for you.
No, not at all. We're happy to answer that one. And Petra, it's just so wonderful to be in conversation with you. You're such an amazing filmmaker and we love your work. So this is a real treat. Thank you. Um, yeah, so the idea for this film really started in the early days of the pandemic, and our main protagonist, Chris Smalls, was in the news in the United States when he led a walkout at the JFK 8 Amazon facility. He protested the company's lack of COVID precautions. So a lot of people, a lot of Amazon workers were still having to go to work and were getting sick, as a lot of people were. It was a real emergency. So he led this protest and then was fired by the company right after he led the protest and started, you know, organizing at that point, leading actions and protests at Jeff Bezos's various mansions, was in the news and caught the attention of our producers, Samantha and Mars, who contacted him to explore the possibilities of a film. This was long before the group decided to start a unionization effort. Um, so they reached out to me, and we were, having conversations about the film, thinking about a team that included, Steve and our amazing cinematographer Martin, and it was at that point that Chris and a few folks that were still working at JFK 8 decided that they were going to do a really kind of surprising thing, which was start a unionization effort. And I say it was surprising because um, Amazon has never been unionized in the American context. In 20 years, there's never been a union there. And in fact, there was one major attempt in the spring of 2021 to unionize a warehouse in Alabama, and it resulted in defeat. So when Chris and others decided to start their own effort, it really felt like an opportunity to be there from day one of an organizing effort, but also to watch a group of people do a thing that nobody believed that they could pull off. And sort of, for us as a film team to ask this question of who decides to take on a $1 trillion company when the odds are so stacked against them? Why, in the wake of defeat, would you start your own independent unionization campaign? And so we rallied really quickly and got, a team on the ground right away so that we could document the struggle from day one.
Yeah, and Brett and I were very were fans of each other's work for a while. And I think interestingly, we were both looking at this idea of how like political structures and systems impact individuals in these unfolding kinds of, you know, situations and doing it in very different ways. And so I think that that was an exciting opportunity to collaborate on something that would bring both of our unique approaches to a project that really needed both a very intimate kind of like excavating in this sort of like patient cinematic mode, and also a macro view that would help us understand that these are in order to understand what's at stake, we need to kind of understand both the political and emotional geography of what these various people from very all walks of life were coming together to do and how that was affecting them and really what compelled them even to risk so much.
Hmm. And for people who don't know your work, how would you describe like the differences and complementarity of you guys like body of work?
Yeah, I think that, for me, this is the first time I've worked really in a kind of verite mode and a longitudinal observation mode. I sort of have dabbled with that form, but my films I describe them all as political films, political filmmaking, interested in big challenging questions around, in previous work, the prison, the American prison system, climate change anxiety. But I tend to work more with very formal, creative and conceptual conceits and a lot of sort of boundaries that I set up. Sometimes I even work in the essayistic mode. And this is the first time I've worked in a verite film, whereas Steve has a lot of experience in that and working in that form.
Yeah, I mean, I love the observational mode. The majority of my work kind of has been situated in this idea that, we're trying to kind of invert the notion of what is newsworthy by giving audiences, the public, the opportunity to not just bear witness, but to be really invited to live in moments that might otherwise be utterly forgettable or um, certainly not headline grabbing, but yet actually help us peel away the layers and understand why both, you know, emotional disruption is directly tied to political disruption, and this idea that people who are engaged in highly um, consequential organizing acts or acts of social justice, so to speak, um, really need to be understood not just in sort of like terms of the most noisy notions of what they're doing, but really like how their experience ties to this larger portrait of what their community is going through.
And I think this is something that Steve and I really do have in common and really came together in this film is this interest, this shared interest in structures and systems of power and how they manifest and make themselves, felt in the intimate lives of real people who are just living their lives, but are, of course, affected and completely informed by a sort of broader political apparatuses and institutions.
Mm-hmm. Fanon, what would be the theories that inspire you or that like help you look at your films, like intellectual theories that help unveil what you're looking at?
Hmm. That's such a big question. I'll try to give Steve a beat unless you have an idea to jump in with, Steve.
I mean,
Um,
I'll just say quickly, like we all know that we're in this moment, and in so much in your work, Petra, like this idea that this is, a battle of competing narratives, right? That this idea of
Mm-hmm.
like storytelling is been for hundreds of years been kind of at the crux of authoritarian behavior, of like, very extractive, abusive behavior. I mean, Mussolini called the cinema the greatest weapon, and Gordon Parks used the camera, referred to his camera as the chosen weapon of choice to uncover social injustice. And so, there in between lie people who actually, in this very moment, understand like the tools of cultural production are very important in them advancing what they are trying to say, not just because they want to say it, but because they need to push back against the narrative. Amazon puts millions of dollars into promoting this idea that they are Earth's best employer. And so people believe
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and speaking of people believing it, I mean, I think something we talked about a lot was a sort of question of how people come to accept a status quo. And, the theorist that comes to my mind is Gramsci, and the idea of common sense, of hegemony, of like, capitalism, not just creating a world in which some have more power than others, but also carrying with it a kind of logic that people internalize as like there could be nothing else. Like this little tiny bit of power, the fact that I'm powerless is somehow my fault. Or somehow temporary rather than deeply embedded in the sort of structures that we're all living with, but that we could also fight against. And that was really, something we were really interested in observing within this group of people that forms this union is just how the politics of class and race play out. So thinking about class and race and gender not as identities, as fixed identities, but as actually kind of structuring devices that at some moments in the struggle, this group of people was able to overcome those differences. Those differences meant very little, because they had common cause against a shared antagonist, which is
Mhm.
Amazon. But at other moments of, especially of high tension, you feel the differences in class and race really break people down and make it impossible for them to not only understand each other, but feel like they're respected by each other or understood by each other. And you see those moments as moments of disintegration and disorganization. And
Mhm.
that was really interesting to us. I feel like that's not something, yeah, something that we felt like cinema could actually help us not just think about, but really feel and care about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what for me was most impressive about the film because other verite films end up being almost depoliticized or simplistic because they're just documenting what is happening in the here and now without much thought behind the process of editing. And with your film, you could feel, I mean, I could feel that you were clearly thinking about class. You were clearly thinking about race. You were clearly thinking about structures of power, and all that you managed so elegantly to convey just through the editing and what you chose to film and accompany. And for that, I would like to talk a bit about process. Um, how did you organize this process of filmmaking? Like, for how many months, years did you film? Who filmed? Who was there? How did you choose the characters that you were accompanying over time? And then we can talk about the editing process.
Sure, I'll just start. I mean, we shot about 300 days, and Martin DeCicco, our incredible DP, and I operated camera on the ground. I mean, I think really one of the kind of hardest and most like rewarding parts of the process was just how uncertain and unknowable the unfolding organizing was. I mean, there were questions that we were confronting from early on about um, how complex kind of the relationships and the social dynamics were becoming, as well as how uncertain um, any sense of victory was in the early days and leading up even to the victory. And so I think this idea of just kind of like time spent was really was something super important because it also allowed us to renew this understanding of trust that we were trying to thread a very tricky needle. We wanted to make a document of a very complex moment in the labor movement and do it as honestly and with as much kind of also a sense of like critical analysis embedded in there without having to spell anything out, right? Speaking to something you were saying earlier, like the the last thing we need is yet another kind of project that is a sort of essentially an empathy machine, right? Like we need to do what documentary, some of the great observational, documentarians have done in the past, like Ricky Leacock, who kind of think about it in terms of like this obsession of being there and the feeling of being there, because it affords you an opportunity to understand the deeply complex reality of people's lived experiences, and to be able to experience that would allows the wider public to kind of have a bit of a transformational understanding. Hello.
I just want to say, since Petra, your daughter Luna is here, there are a lot of organizers that we were documenting that have young kids. I have a young kid, Steve has a young kid, and we don't talk a lot about parenting while also being filmmakers or organizers. We it was really important for us, even though we were documenting a group of people mostly at a bus stop doing this organizing work, to give some sense in the film that these are complex, real people with lots of obligations and lots of stresses, including going home, to kids who are trying to get on Zoom school, or like single parents doing night shifts and bringing their kids to school before taking a 2-hour commute. We were juggling filmmaking with child rearing, which is one of the benefits of having this being a co-directed project, is just being real about the fact that, like, there's a lot of ways in which we've got complex obligations in this world. And I think one of the themes that was really, really important to us to hit in this film was care. That, among other things, this isn't just like a political struggle with great strategy, but these are people that showed up, especially in the early days, because at the tent they found other people that cared about them, and their job didn't care about them, and society told, for many of these folks, doesn't care about them, and they showed up at the tent, or they showed up even on a Zoom call, and someone was there being, oh my God, I know what that feels like. Oh, that's a terrible thing, let me help you figure that out, and that's like the relationship between solidarity and care is real, and so we wanted to acknowledge within the filmmaking, as a process, and then also what's on screen, the fact that caregiving extends to family and to coworkers.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And was there ever a dilemma? Because when we're documenting something that is dear to us, I've felt it. I don't know if you felt it, of like, it feels that you're so intimate with all the characters, right? And they need all the help they can get. Were you collaborating? Were you helping in any way in their efforts? Were there moments where you're like, oh my God, I should drop the camera and help this guy put up his tent? Or things like that? And can you share a bit of those internal struggles?
Yeah, I mean, there were countless times where I felt like we were at the center of such an incredibly complex situation. This growing and changing unit of people were experiencing some of the greatest duress that they had ever gone through in their lives, and they were becoming organizers for the first time in real time. And so we were kind of in a situation where we understood things that with great access and privilege that others didn't. And so there were so many times where, like, after this like 12, 14-hour shoot, then one of the participants calls, and just driving home, you're just then talking to them for another hour and a half about the thing that they know that, like, we were the only ones to have witnessed and could understand. And so I would say, like, I spent far more time just sitting there at the tent with them and then talking about situations in private, or in complex group dynamics, than filming. I mean, the moment when the hurricane happened, I was actually, it was like back to back, like very late night shoots, and it was the election was coming to a fevered pitch, and I was so exhausted. I went to my car to just close my eyes for 10 minutes, and I woke up to the sound and of screaming, and it was the tent blowing up, a mile high, and I ran out, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to help them. But our role here is actually to memorialize how hard and all the ways that it is hard for them. And so I just thought, okay, I have to just do the thing that we're taught early on. At the very least, hold a shot for 12 seconds and then go. And so I did that. I didn't even like have time to focus the shot, as you can see. And then I ran over and was like, "Hey, are you okay?" And it was so funny that, like, Josiah's reaction is a very sort of like convivial one, and he's playing it down, but yet it was actually very dangerous. There were pipes flying around, and they could have been very hurt. So I think that that was a very emblematic moment of just like how deep in we were, and how much it was for us to, it was important to us to just be there with them.
Yeah. No, and I'm happy you held the shot for 12 seconds because it's one of the strongest shots. I
I should
feel
have focused it.
like that shot with the capital container flowing, those two are like this, or the rocket going up, are like the synthesis of our times.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's another moment in the film. I mean, we have a protagonist in the film who's unhoused, Natalie, who's a really important part of the story. And there's a moment in which, Chris is on the phone with her and he's finding out that she's unhoused. He didn't know that. And that's also the moment that the film team is finding out that she's unhoused. We've been with her at this point for months. She's been part of the organizing, and we had no idea that she lived in her car, like many Amazon workers actually do. So, like we, of course, tried to help her find housing like that. We weren't going to make that a feature of the film, but that's just there are, because we care about people and it was just stressing to find this out. So we did work with Natalie to try and find her housing, which is really challenging in New York. But I think like our ethics as filmmakers are that, even when you're working in the observational mode, which is supposed to be about pretending the filmmakers don't exist, we're not interested in that. Of course we exist. This is our perspective on what we witnessed. And we are making this film because we care. And if we didn't care, I don't think we should be making the film.
And lastly, like the current events that make this film all the more timely with the strikes of Amazon workers. Can you talk a bit about that, the strikes and Christmas Eve?
Yeah, so an exciting development after the film ends is that the ALU affiliates with the Teamsters. So it's ALU IBT Local 1 now. And so the Teamsters issued a deadline for Amazon to come to the negotiating table by December 15th. And lo and behold, Amazon did not show up to negotiate a new contract. And so the International Brotherhood of Teamsters,
Just a second for international people. What is the ALU and the team? If you can give a bit
oh, I'm
of
sorry. Yeah,
context.
ALU is the Amazon Labor Union, which is featured in the film, and the Teamsters is one of the major legacy unions in the United States. So that was a big deal for that affiliation to happen. And so basically, they issued a strike announcement that two buildings in New York City were strike ready and have now gone on strike for 3 days. And what we're seeing is a nationwide actual series of other strikes in Georgia, California, Illinois, Michigan, and counting. And so this is really becoming one of the biggest strike action against Amazon. And it's incredibly electric. We've been out there filming and, to try and do a small follow-up piece that is, and it's just been incredibly invigorating and proof positive that like small grassroots movements do have the ability to actually capture the imagination of other workers and actually inspire people to come out and push back against this.
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate how what a big deal it is because I think Amazon's tactic, as well as like really intense union busting, and firing people at will has also been to completely underestimate its workers. I mean, one of the things you see in the film is just this really scrappy group of people that's been underestimated their whole lives, continue to be underestimated by these big legacy unions and by the company. Nobody thinks that they're going to be victorious. And then when they are victorious, the company is just trying to stall them out, refusing to come to the negotiating table, as Steve says. And so these strikes are a show of force. They're like, we have refused to lose by power of attrition, and we're still here and we're stronger than ever. And we are a real threat, not just at this one warehouse, but all over the country and hopefully all over the world, because of course, Amazon is a global company. The supply chain capitalism is a planetary phenomena. And for workers really to have any power, they're going to have to coordinate internationally, which I think they already are.
You
Hmm.
And you could tell that Amazon is certainly concerned by this challenge to their power because, they're doing things like in Queens, they turned on the water out on the outside of the building to flood this street and sidewalk where the organizers had set up warming stations, sign-up stations, food for, hungry workers coming and going.
In
And
the middle of
so
winter.
yeah, we're below freezing right now. We're in a real cold spell, and so it's turning into a dangerous, icy, flooded, organizing space. And it's incredibly inhumane. You can't even imagine what you can imagine, right? Why a corporation would go to such a measure. And so I
Yeah.
think it's proving that they're concerned. This is a real moment.
Wow. And are some of these strikers having the chance to see your film? And how have you thought of the Impact campaign, which I know has done amazing things so far?
Yeah, well, Amazon Labor Union is actually a release partner. So we've given them rights to the film to do their own digital release. So all 100% of the proceeds are going that they sell are going to their solidarity and organizing fund. So and yeah, like a lot of organizers and workers are coming up and saying, "Hey, we saw the film. Thank you so much." So we're doing everything we can to get it to workers, not just at Amazon too, but beyond.
Well, congratulations. I'm really rooting for you and the film, and hope. Uh, and are there Portuguese subtitles or Spanish subtitles that are available? And how can people that are not in the Academy see the film around the world? My last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have Spanish subtitles. We need to get Portuguese ones done. This is a very scrappy team, so we're doing a self-release. We are not funded to do that at the scale that we're attempting to. But people can go to unionthefilm.com to get to our release platform called Gather, where the film can be rented, and for workers or people with limited means to be able to watch it for free through a pay it forward feature that we were able to design with this company.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Petra.
Thank you so much.
So good to be in conversation.
Yes, very inspiring.